Welcome to the impact of the U.S. election on the Canada-U.S. relationship. I'm happy you could join us for this conversation. This session is a part of the Rising Economy Week, an immersive week-long virtual event co-hosted by the South Island Prosperity Partnership and the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. And I'm very pleased to be joined to launch this session with the chairman and director of the South Island Prosperity Partnership, Frank Morrison. And Frank had an illustrious career there in Victoria. Past chair of Our Place Community Advisory Board, the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce, board of BC Youth Futures, lifetime member of Tourism Victoria, and the treasurer of the Victoria Spirit Committee. Frank has also been a board member of Tourism BC. For 12 years, was a partner and tourism consulting director of Grant Thornton LLP, Chartered Accountants and Management Consultants. He was regional manager for Earls for 15 years, and then 10 years owned and operated 10 of his own restaurants. I'm sure many of you have eaten at Frank's restaurants. Frank, we're so delighted to have you with us. And let me tell you how happy Penwar is to be co-hosting this entire week-long session with the South Island Prosperity Partnership. Over to you, Frank.
Thanks very much, Matt. We're, of course, delighted to welcome you all to this session today on behalf of myself as chair and our board of directors at South Island Prosperity Partnership. Of course, our unique and great partnership we have with Penwar. We're looking forward to doing more cross-border with you guys. The Canada-U.S. relationship is so critical to our economy, our shared culture, and how we recover and move forward towards getting through this pandemic. It's critical that we work together. So really pleased to have Christopher Sands with us today. I'm really looking forward to your session, and I'll turn it back to you, Matt.
All right, thank you, Frank. I should say that Penwar, for those of you who don't know, is the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. It's a 30-year statutory group chartered by Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Yukon, and Northwest Territories. So we have a big geography, and if this group of 10 jurisdictions were a nation, we have about the 12th largest GDP in the world of any country. What we're seeing, and we're here at a very critical time as we're looking at a new US administration, and every time that does happen, it's an opportunity to bring new ideas to the fore. And, you know, from a Penwar perspective, the Canada-U.S. relationship is the largest trading relationship history of the globe. It's very, very significant, but sometimes we don't invest enough in the relationship. So I'm delighted to have Chris Sands, a good friend and, you know, someone who's been with me in the trenches for the 25 years on the Canada-U.S. relationship. And just to give an introduction, Chris is the director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. He's an adjunct professor also of Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins, Paul Niski School of Advanced International Studies. And he has really directed a lot of policy research on the Canada-U.S. relationship over the last 25 years. Sometimes for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Hudson Institute. He's been commissioned by different think tanks, including the American Enterprise Institute, Brookings, the Center for Study of the Presidency and Congress, the Migration Policy Institute, National Endowment for Democracy. In Canada, Chris has been a contributor to studies at the C.D. Howe Institute, Fraser Institute. He is currently a board member of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute, the Institute for Research on Public Policy, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and prior to joining Wilson Center, in his role at SAIS, he also taught college at the business and economics at Western Washington. And so he was commuting to Bellingham and we did a number of things together during that time. Back in his early history, Chris was a Fulbright scholar and worked his doctoral dissertation at the Norman Patterson School of International Studies in Carleton. And in 2019 was named a senior fellow at Massey College at the University of Toronto. So we're really fortunate, Chris, to have you for a bit of time and an open dialogue. I'd like to say to everyone listening, we're going to have lots of opportunity to address your questions, and I'd like to ask you to put them into the Q&A box on your screen. We'll be scrolling through those questions as we have this open discussion. Okay, so thank you everyone for being here. I guess before I start questions, well, maybe Chris, I'll give you a chance to say hello, and then I have a slew of questions, and we'll just have an open dialogue because it's a station. So I'll open it for you to say a few opening remarks, Chris, before we get into that.
Matt, this is Mike. I am on here.
Okay, Mike. I think if can't see you, Mike, but do you want to say a few words before we enter our discussion? We can hear you.
You can hear me good.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, I'm rolling down. I'm coming down off the Continental Divide on Highway 12 into our capital city of Helena. We're gathering up for our new legislative session. We begin our planning today. And I am the president of BENWR. I've been active with BENWR for 10 or 12 years, and on the executive board for at least 5 years. My degree was in journalism from the University of Montana. Early in my career, I happened to live out at Lyndon, Washington, which is just below the border, north of Bellingham, south of Vancouver. Spent a lot of time back and forth across the border in those days, and then returned to my home country in Montana, where I also live. Currently, my home is 4 miles south of the Canadian border. We have many family connections across the border, many economic connections over my career. I am currently state senator, Senate District 1, which borders on the state of Idaho and borders on the southeastern part of British Columbia. And I am hour and a half drive away from Alberta over Crow's Nest Pass. So we have a close relationship. The little community I live in relies heavily on economics dealings back and forth across the border. We have a number of products, trucks that are essential traffic, running up and down Main Street, hauling chips and lumber back and forth between the two nations. We acquire lots of road oil and gasoline and propane and other products. So I understand the relationship from a boots on the ground standpoint. I enjoy my role in BENWR. I appreciate greatly this connectiveness that BENWR tries to give, and we make a real effort, and it is a great problem solution oriented organization. So I think, Matt, perhaps that's enough if you want to go ahead with the program.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Cuff. We appreciate hearing from you. Sorry we can't see you, but we will carry on. And if you want to jump in toward the end, we would welcome it. But thank you.
You bet.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll go back to hearing from Chris Sands. Dr. Sands, a few words before I get into specific questions.
Sure. Just it's nice to reconnect with the Pacific Northwest. Two things come to mind. One is that during the last Canadian election, we had a Canadian election watching party in Washington, D.C. that brought my university students to, and we all worked together to watch the returns come in both English and French. And Senator Cuff was in attendance, and it was great to have the chance to chat with him. He is very committed to the region, and I think he's a great leader for Pinwar. I'm also struck because of the South Island Prosperity Partnership, I am reminded that I have on my wall a gift from my lovely wife, whose name is Victoria. It's a image of a stained glass window in the BC legislature. And those of you who've been to the BC legislature, you know there's some beautiful windows with a little wise words, I guess. And the one that my wife got me is, "Fortitude is the virtue of adversity." And having survived the Trump years, I feel like I've had a lot of adversity, but I'm hoping that I now have the fortitude to make it through the Biden era and beyond.
That's great, Chris. Well, that is where I was going to start. We're veterans in the Canada-U.S. NAFTA wars of the last 4 years, and fortunately, we have a USMCA agreement. But with the new U.S. administration, what do you think what are your thoughts on the implications for the Canada-U.S. relationship of a Biden administration?
Well, I think actually most of the implications are really positive. Joe Biden's no stranger to Canada. Canada's not unfamiliar with him. He's been a figure in U.S. politics for a long time, and particularly because he served for so long in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and in fact as a leader of that committee, as chairman, his views on global policy are well known. People in the Pinwar region will remember that he led the delegation from the Obama administration to the Vancouver Winter Olympics in 2010. And after the Trump election, before the end of the Obama administration in 2016, he famously went to Ottawa, toasted Justin Trudeau at a dinner, and said, "The progressive torch is passed to you and to Angela Merkel." I don't know about that Angela Merkel gal, but definitely there's a fondness between the two. I don't like to call it bromance. I think it's that was maybe an Obama thing, but there's definitely a great friendship. Now, you say, why does that matter? It matters because I think the president and the prime minister serve not as the drivers of the relationship, but as the fire department for the relationship. And when things go wrong, you can call on them to help work out the disputes, the disagreements, the unanticipated consequences of inadvertent policy actions that cause a problem for the relationship. And because we're jointly restricting the border, because we're implementing USMCA, which has a lot of wiggle room in the text, there are going to be lots of opportunities for us to bump into one another, to have disputes that will need some addressing by the presidential prime ministerial level. And really, after 2018, Donald Trump's relationship with Justin Trudeau really soured. They could be correct; they would do what was necessary, but they weren't necessarily able partners. And so, to have that back, I think, is good news.
Well, Chris, because we've since March had our border closed for all but essential traffic, and thank goodness our commerce is flowing relatively smoothly. But as you know, I'm co-chair of the Future Borders Coalition. We have called since July for a clear plan on reopening or easing restrictions on the Canada-US border. Can you tell us a little about the task force that you're working on with, we had Governor Gregoire on yesterday, with Governor Gregoire, Rick Snyder, and Anne McClellan, and Jean Charest, to come up with specific ideas on the easing of the restrictions. Talk about, where do you see us in getting to some kind of a structured process to ease those restrictions, because it is causing a huge impact out here.
Absolutely. So there are a couple of challenges with the border. One of them, which is a technical challenge, is how do you screen for health reasons, the people who pass back and forth across the border, to minimize the risk that cross-border transit will spread the pandemic. With testing, we're always trying to advance the latest technology for quick and efficient, but also reliable tests. That's a technical challenge. Both countries are working on it. We'll get there, but that's one dimension of the problem. Another dimension of the problem is political. Most of our citizens, although not so much in those border regions that Mike Cuff and you live in, but most of our citizens have the impression that that there's risk if we reopen the border. Certainly Canadians have seen the varied responses across the 50 states and seen some horror stories and some things that seem to be going well. Bad news travels more than good news. And so there's a concern in Canada that if you lift the border restrictions, that some of the worst experiences, the states that have had real problems will spread the infection, and Canada will have not only a second wave, but a much bigger potential third wave. And there are parts of the United States which are completely ignorant of what Canada's been doing, have no idea, but have heard it's bad everywhere and don't necessarily want to expose themselves to those risks. So for any politician, Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau, the challenge is to find a political solution here that works in the best science, but also gives people the confidence that opening the border is not going to risk public health. That's why we turned to this task force, which we pulled together. We're very grateful that we had some real politically smart leaders representing the diversity of the border, the diversity of politics, diversity of economics. Certainly Governor Gregoire's involved in the Cascadia Innovation Corridor. That's a very sort of modern look, very 21st century look at the way the border can work, not as a barrier, but as a membrane that allows for us to exchange both ideas and technology. And then Governor Snyder from Michigan, who represents the sort of traditional view we all have of the border, you know, automobiles and busy crossings with trucks, plus a sense from Canada, Quebec, and also many of your viewers will remember that Anne McClellan, who was Deputy Prime Minister, but also Minister of Public Safety, represented Edmonton, although she's originally from Nova Scotia. So you have two important parts of Canada represented there. So we've tried to make sure that it's representative. But what we're looking for are smart people who can listen to the best presentations from groups like the Future Border Coalition, from Pinware, any of the members that want to let us know that you have an idea or you have something to share, maybe an experience of the border. We're very open to hearing from as many people as possible. And then translate that into the kind of digestible recommendations that Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden and his administration could begin to implement. And one of the things we've looked for, in addition to sort of pilot projects and innovative experiments, is just a baseline sense of phasing. We've seen this with most of the states and communities that have imposed restrictions on economic activity and movement. Almost all of them have also issued a set of data points and phases, so that as conditions change, there can be more or less restriction on economic activity. I think those jurisdictions that have done that have had fewer problems with people just sort of breaking the rules, because people have hope that if conditions get better, that the freedom gets better and that they'll be able to get back a little bit to their normal lives. That's the kind of challenge that we're facing. And the border, federally managed, whether we like it or not, we just haven't had any of those kinds of indications. It's just been business as usual. And as you know, Matt, every 30 days, a renewal, usually actually after 20 days of the current restriction, we renew for another 30 days. We've tinkered at the margins, but it's not been very much of an evolving situation. And as time goes on, and the focus both of Pinware, but also of groups like the Canadian American Business Council, Scotty Greenwood's group, starts to focus on how do we get the economy going again? How do we rebound? This is a recession we didn't want, but we have to get out of. I mean, it's one thing to be sick. We don't want to be sick, but we also like to have jobs, and we need to get the economy going again. So as we move towards that, some clear indication to the business community that tourism can return, that cross-border shopping can return, that non-essential crossers, discretionary crossers, can once again get involved, get in their car, go and visit the other country and enjoy what it has to offer. We need to offer that kind of signaling. And I think it's an essential part of the management of this pandemic. And we just haven't seen that from the federal government. I'm hopeful we'll see it now, and I'm hopeful our task force will contribute a little bit to the nuts and bolts, not the butts and nolts, but the nuts and bolts of how you would actually implement that.
That's great, Chris. Well, our colleague Lori is saying, you know, we heard from the ambassadors this morning that, they were happy that it only took a week to collaborate on a joint policy on the border. But why has it taken 8 months to begin to talk about a scientific criteria for easing these restrictions, asks Lori. And any thoughts on that? I mean, of course, there was an election in the middle of this time, but we pride ourselves on being integrated and collaborative as two nations that depend on one another. Oh, it sounds like there hasn't been a lot of interaction on what criteria and what are the ways that we can begin moving the dial here? Any thoughts?
Well, a couple of thoughts. I think initially the joint border restriction was a proactive proposal from Canada at a time when the Trump administration hadn't really focused on the land border as part of the strategy. They were just dealing with how do we get a vaccine, what's the best guidance on masks. You saw all of that unfold in real time. And as a proposal, it was trying to get ahead of the kind of US response to China, to Japan for a time, to Europe, which is a unilateral closure that offers no hope at all. Those were very destructive economically. They were frustrating, but they would have been even more devastating in the case of Canada and Mexico. Canada moved first, saying we want to get ahead of this. Let's jointly manage the border, in part because that made it a joint decision and gave Canada a seat at the table to talk about how to manage it. That having been done, a couple of things came with that. One, by allowing essential traffic and truck traffic, they eased some of what would ordinarily be pressure to open the border a bit more. And I'll remind people, you don't need to be reminded probably, but one of the reasons we're restricting the border is we don't want to see COVID spread. But we are not actually health screening any of the truck drivers who are moving goods back and forth. That's not part of the system. So, we might think, well, at least we're jointly restricted. That gives us low risk. Not necessarily, and not indefinitely. So it's important that we advance this policy and make it work better. But then what happened, I think, is, and I hate to say this, but it's not a shock, American politics. The US elections, which go on so darn long, tend to eclipse a lot of what are considered secondary policy issues. We still have a lot of energy to focus on China, sort of big issues that are on the agenda, but issues that require a little bit of nuance and technical expertise tend to get eclipsed. And that has put us in a position where we just haven't seen serious talks between the governments at all on these issues. Now, that's not to say DHS and public safety haven't had dialogues, but we haven't had the kind of political dialogue that could move those restrictions. I'll leave you, though, with a reason I'm optimistic about this election, and it might be counterintuitive. But as you look at the result in the Congress, we see a very gridlocked Congress, a very narrow majority so far for the Democrats in the House, and a very slim, depending on how Georgia goes in a couple of days, potential Republican control of the Senate. That doesn't look like a reason for optimism, but for me, it is. It is because nothing will move through this Congress, no matter how important it is to Joe Biden, unless it has at least some bipartisan support. And members are going to be looking at 22, that is the 2022 midterm elections, where House members will all be up and a chunk of the Senate will be up, and thinking, in a time of COVID, I spend less time at home in the district. I'm not listening, I don't have the chance to pick up what's going on in my home state. This is where state legislators, governors, and others will, I think, gain a much larger voice as they try to focus not on the partisan politics of Washington, but on the realities on the ground and how people are being affected by the policies enacted by Washington. And I think when the regions of the United States, when state governments and local leaders have greater input, not that state governments can't be partisan. We know California can be very partisan. Texas can be very partisan. But when you poll local leaders, there's a pragmatism that comes with it because they have to face the voters, not just in elections, but every day walking around in their neighborhood. And I think the immediacy of local politics makes it pragmatic to an extent that we just don't often see in Washington. So that gives me hope that there'll be maybe some progress, or at least a potential for progress going forward.
No, that's a great insight. And our friend Alan Burson has always called it interdomestic. And maybe you could describe for our Canadian audience here, why, from a Canadian perspective, they just look at the president and and so much of the interest of policy that affects Canada comes from Congress. Can you comment on that?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, the U.S. system has been turning presidents into celebrities. We used to talk in the Nixon administration about the imperial presidency that overshadows everything else. And Congress, I hate to say this, and I don't say there's any partisan side, but if you look at the three branches of the American government, and not yet to the fourth, but the three big branches, the presidency and the administration, the Congress and the Supreme Court, the Congress is the least popular of all those institutions. It gets the lowest satisfaction ratings, even when Trump was not popular, and he had dark days in terms of his personal popularity. He was much more popular than the Congress. And I think, just as an American, that's always worried me for the functioning of the U.S. constitutional order, because when one part of the system is in such disrepute, it has a hard time performing its constitutional functions of oversight, check and balance for the administration. And a weak Congress really, it may make presidents happy because they get more of what they want or they think they can, but ultimately, it would be better if Congress was a stronger organization. And during the Trump years, the debate in Congress has increasingly been focused on reclaiming congressional powers, by which I mean a couple of things. One, past Congresses gave broad latitude to the executive branch to do things in a series of blank checks. For example, the process by which presidents decide to use national security tariffs in the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, or could second business to perform functions in the Defense Production Act by just telling 3M or other companies, do what we need you to do. These were powers given to presidents who, by Congresses that thought, well, no president would be so irresponsible to abuse these powers. And now they're starting to think, well, wait a minute, maybe we need to have some rules around those processes. Then you have processes like the presidential permit process for cross-border infrastructure. When that was set up through a series of executive orders, Congress didn't think it was necessary to have legislation to guide that process. And so we ended up in the Obama administration debating whether the president had a right to claim that national security was threatened by climate change as a justification for blocking the Keystone XL pipeline extension from going across the border, his one piece of control. So everybody's got different politics. I don't want to take the side, just that Congress is reasserting itself, I think would be a healthy thing to see out of the 117th Congress. There's another area where I think the Congress has been a little slack, and many of the legislators who participate in pinwheel will recognize this, and that's in passing increasingly long and complicated bills that delegate substantial authority for implementing these statutes to agencies to do so through rulemaking. That has two effects. One, it puts Congress in the business of the happy talk of you shall do this, but not having to work out the real problems of implementation, so that when you take something like the Affordable Care Act and it doesn't work as planned, Congress says, well, it's the agency's fault. They didn't roll it out right. Well, yes, but you kind of had such a vague piece of legislation that it was very difficult to reconcile with the actual situation on the ground. That led us to blame bureaucrats. Oh, it's the public service in Washington. They're the swamp. They're the ones that are not getting it done. Well, actually, they're doing the best they can with the situation. And it was Congress that I think in some ways didn't do all the work they could have done to make sure that that legislation was written in a tight fashion so it could get things done that they aimed to do. Not only that, it contributed to the demonization of the swamp that helped elect somebody like Donald Trump. And for many Americans, gave them the strong perception that Washington doesn't care, that it was a bunch of fancy pants elites and establishment types, guilty as charged, who made decisions based on their, intellectual best judgment or their political best judgment, but not necessarily on the conditions on the ground. And just a last point, I don't mean to be a bit of a, depressing figure, but I think one of the things that has been wrong with our politics is that COVID has affected different people in different ways. It affects small business more than it affects big business because they have less capacity to manage all this change. It's affected people who work with their hands, whether they're first responders or frontline healthcare workers, or whether they're auto mechanics or people working in a factory, many of whom have lost their jobs. And for people who talk for a living like I do, I can telecommute. I'm visiting you here from my basement. That's fine. But there have been a lot of people who've felt a disproportionate cost from this pandemic. They're really suffering. And that has fueled a politics of Washington doesn't care about me. And I think that's hurt Washington. It's hurt America. You haven't had that to the same extent in Canada. And many of the Canadian viewers will know that the premiers haven't always been perfect either, but they've been in much more of a cooperative relationship with Ottawa, which has been so far able to provide the money that has allowed public health, education, and other services to be delivered at the level that people expect, as well as providing some money for people to stay home if they can't work and not worry about how their bills are going to get paid. So Canada's, I think, got it right here. But the US system, it's not just that they have the policy wrong, it's that the system isn't functioning as it could, which is something we'll have to work on now after this election.
Okay, back to Canada, US. We you know how the rest of the world looks at the Canada-US relationship to understand America's foreign policy. So as we move to a new administration, what should a Biden administration do in its first 100 days in relationship to Canada to show the world that there's a new day in US foreign policy?
Very important question. There's been a lot of focus in the media, as there often is, on whether Joe Biden will make his first state visit to Canada. I've always marveled that this has become such a basic ask. It was something that started years ago because the U.S. Secret Service wanted a chance to test the system with the new president and all of their, aides and folks in a country where the risk was relatively low and cooperation with the RCMP and so forth was usually very good. But it's become a symbol of how important the country is to the U.S. And we've already seen Parliament vote an invitation to President Biden to come to visit Canada. And for those of you who follow this issue more broadly, you'll know that Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has so far refused to call Joe Biden and congratulate him on winning or refer to him as the president-elect. Mexico, he was elected on his third try running for president, having been, in his mind, denied the presidency unfairly by the Mexican system rigged against him twice before. So he's very sensitive on the subject of congratulations that come before anything's official. So it makes that Canadian outreach that much more remarkable, and I think puts Canada ahead of the line. But that's just symbolism. The important thing is, what can you do that actually that counts? I do think the border is going to be a major concern early on, because it doesn't need a huge amount, but it needs something. Another thing that has been talked about for Biden, the Biden administration, is rejoining the Paris Accords to address climate change. And that is something that could be done very easily. But I would advise the Biden administration and all of us that just rejoining Paris is restoring the sort of status quo ante before Trump took us out of it, but it doesn't necessarily solve the big problems that we have with climate change. It's a step in the right direction, but we have a historic opportunity when the UN climate change talks reconvene in Glasgow. It's supposed to be next month in December. The British postponed hosting for a year because of COVID, of course. And when the nations of the world meet in Glasgow next year, December, I think there's an historic opportunity for, to use a Trumpian phrase, a better deal to address climate change. Addressing one of the most fundamental inequities that we've seen in the climate change debate from the very beginning, which is that Western countries, wealthier countries, have been asked to bear disproportionately the burden of addressing climate change, while developing countries, particularly countries like China, would make pledges to take action only when the US, Canada met their commitments to get us to a certain point. The Copenhagen Agreement that President Obama signed had an 80-year time frame. We were a little bit better in Paris. We had a 40-year time frame. I think Glasgow could actually be a much more reciprocal and fair agreement because China, India, and many developing countries have taken advantage of technology to improve their climate performance. And that could allow them to make commitments today, maybe not as ambitious as what the US and Canada will take on, but all of us pulling together. And it's that kind of unanimity that's been absent from past climate change talks that could really be necessary. But I'm going to tell you something, Matt, that you already know, but maybe some in the audience don't know. But one of the great things about Canadian foreign policy is that Canada is a middle power. It's not the US, which can get people's backs up. It's a country that does its homework and shows up at international conferences and summits and helps bring parties together. I think Canada has a lot of credibility on climate change. The Trudeau government's really invested in carbon pricing and other measures. And Canada could be a bridge between the Europeans, between some of our Asian neighbors, and also the United States, bringing us together through its good offices in those talks. And I think that's a huge opportunity. What prime ministers will tell you, and I know you've had former prime ministers address Pinware audiences many times, Matt, but what they'll usually tell you, if they're honest, is that much of their conversation with the American president of the day is about third country issues. It's not the bilateral issues. It's what does Canada think about Afghanistan? What does Canada think about climate change? What are we going to do with the WTO? How are we going to address UN reform? And those issues are where Canada shows that it may be a smaller population. It may be not as militarily muscly as the United States, but Canada can hold its own intellectually and brings good ideas to the table that don't have the taint of partisan US politics. So for me, I think the most important thing Joe Biden can do for Canada-US relations is to start this new era by listening and listening to Canada about those issues that when Biden was in Ottawa in 2016 and said, we're passing the progressive torch to you, Justin Trudeau. Trudeau needs to pass it back and say, here's the state of things, and there's a lot of work to do, and Canada's here to help you with it. And if we're working together on multilateral issues globally, the bilateral issues, I think, will be easier.
Brilliant, brilliant observation. Chris, we're looking at a major infrastructure bill in Congress. We're looking at stimulus bill. All of them are already written with Buy America. Now, Canada has a real problem. And of course, it's something we've all worked on for decades. What do we do about the Buy America and a waiver for Canada? What's the solution there?
So I think first we have to recognize that the motivation for Buy America has some validity. It has some validity. Congress puts this in, and Joe Biden supported it in the past because American taxpayers like to know that this is benefiting them and that it's not, a lot of spending that will go and benefit someone else. There's political potency in it. Secondly, the USMCA, while it advances many things, broadens the scope of the three federal governments to do domestic set-asides with public money. So we've actually put ourselves at greater risk of Buy American and no longer have what we used to have in NAFTA, or Canada-US free trade, which is the ability to say you are committed to not have national content. We're supposed to only have North American content. We've lost a bit of that with USMCA. So that should put us back on our heels a little bit. If we start with those two recognitions that this is not automatic, nor is it necessarily a nefarious or illegitimate, political claim, then I think we can begin to have a conversation about how to manage Buy American. President Trump talked about reshoring a lot of things that were related to China for national security reasons. I think if we can ring fence those things that have to be Buy American and limit them to relatively few things, that's a good place to start. So for example, on pharmaceuticals and precursor drugs, there are many Americans who think, well, we ought to have our ability to produce those things in America. We shouldn't have to rely on China for that. Acknowledging that that's legit, we then make a separate case that says, well, but Canada is not a threat. And in fact, Canada is a partner on this. We can point to defense production, one of the areas that even in NAFTA and Canada's free trade, the US was never willing to have free trade in defense products. But with Canada, we eliminated national content with the Defense Production Sharing Act in the 1940s. So we've had a special designation for Canada. And I know some people say, well, let's do Buy North American. But I think by just that precedent of Canada being, acceptable, even if Mexico is not, I think is even stronger ground. And we have a great tradition for that. Then comes another argument, which I think is maybe the winning argument for this Congress and for both countries going forward. It hasn't been the focus, but it should be, that we're in a terrible recession. And many state governments are seeing lower tax revenues, and that goes all the way down to the local governments. There's not a lot of money to go around, and until the economy gets growing again, the picture is bleak. We're borrowing a lot of money, but so much that eventually we're going to start paying higher interest rates, and that could be problematic for our future growth. In that environment, not because we're Canada's trying to take advantage of America or anything like that, I think we should be talking about good value for the taxpayers' money. And good value means don't put restrictions on that don't have a purpose. You can say, buy American because we don't want to rely on China because we don't feel we can trust them. Fair enough. That may be legit. But with Canada, which has a lot of skill, a lot of talent, a lot of raw ingredients that can go into infrastructure projects, Canada makes a different case. And I think if you want good value for the taxpayer, you shouldn't limit bids to American companies that work in the United States, where prices may, in some cases, not all cases, be a little bit higher. But, and this is the big but, this is where Canada will have to show its cards. Canada also does domestic set-asides, and Canada does occasionally hold some areas back, whether it's Hydro-Quebec and being able to bid on some of their construction projects. Quebec has its own protections. There are other provinces that have done set-asides or try to exclude certain parts of their market from U.S. participation. Really, this should be a reciprocal avoidance of domestic set-asides against one another. I think that reciprocity, again, is the kind of thing that will make this easier to resolve. And there's some things that Canada could do on that.
Brilliant. Well, can we start with the public health supply chain? That we're going to need vaccines and everything involving COVID response and recovery, and that should certainly be exempt from any kind of restriction with Canada.
It should be, but I've been very nervous about this debate, and we're not doomed yet, but I worry about this. As you probably remember, the American pharmaceutical companies and the international pharmaceutical companies always like to charge a very high price to recoup the cost of R&D, and the U.S. is probably the most aggressive in protecting their ability to do that through intellectual property rights protections that we saw in the TPP, even though the U.S. didn't join, but also in the USMCA. Maybe not as much as some of the pharmaceutical companies wanted on biologics, but they still got a pretty good deal. At a recent meeting I was at talking about COVID response, one of the interesting things was to see the Mexican industry representatives pledging to use Mexican capacity to quickly make as much vaccine and as much personal protective equipment as could be made to help the US recover from COVID. And one of the reasons they were so willing to do that is that these companies in Mexico, the majority of the Mexican industry, is either owned by the Americans or the Europeans, and they all wanted to play nice. The Canadian pharmaceutical industry is an industry that has been predominantly made up of generic manufacturers that take things when they come off patent to make them more affordably for Canadians. And the relationship, as you'll remember, Matt, between American pharmaceutical companies and Canada in the pharmaceutical space has been quite negative, with a NAFTA Chapter 11 case launched by Eli Lilly over the promise doctrine. Even the Harper government very reluctant to resolve that problem. Now, why do I bring that up now? The logical common sense thing to do is that when we have one or more vaccine formulas, that we use every bit of our productive capacity in North America to produce as much as is humanly possible to get it to people as quickly as possible. And Canada has capacity, but right now that Canadian capacity is not trusted by the international pharmaceutical companies because of bad blood. This is a huge diplomatic challenge, but one that I think the governments could address. We've seen within the United States the drug companies coming to an agreement that they will all produce the vaccines and share the formulas, but they'll also sort out the royalties on the back end and agree to cease and desist so that the originator can have the patent once we move past a period of crisis. With the federal government in the United States playing a big role because we're financing a lot of the R&D that goes into trying to discover this vaccine right now. And of course the FDA, but also the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, all doing that. So the taxpayer can say, we're helping you build this, so we're gonna expect you to play nice with the other companies. That is not happening with regard to the Canadians, even though our hospitals, our medical researchers work together all the time. I think it requires proactive diplomacy, but if we're able to work together to produce the vaccine to help get the economy going, this is the kind of thing you could maybe heal the breach between Canada's pharmaceutical companies and the American ones. And I think it's an historic opportunity to do something better. President Biden's phrase is build back better. And so if we're going to build back better than before, healing the relationships between pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers across the Canada-US divide would be a step in the right direction.
Who's working on that now?
I don't work on anything. I just talk, as you could probably tell. I'm a little worried, Matt, that you're going to import one of those things from the presidential debates where you have a shut off button so you can stop my mic when I'm filibustering on your questions. To my knowledge, this has not been something that's working. In fact, the conversations are happening more on the private industry side with the support of government rather than at government initiative. But I think that what they're missing is what's going on in Canada. And if I can opine a little bit here, I think this is one of the great problems in Canada-US relations that electing Joe Biden will not fix. And that is that the US federal government has really lost the ability to think strategically and creatively about Canada-US relations because their baseline level of knowledge is often too low to really know what to do with Canada. Washington has become much more reactive to ideas that come from Pinware or ideas that come from the Canadians themselves because we just don't think about Canada enough. We don't have enough basic knowledge to know how Canada could fit in and help be part of the solution, not just part of our problems. And I think that's meant that Canada-US relations become more transactional and they've underperformed what they could be. Certainly what they have been in the past. And that's contributed to this sense that even when Trump isn't insulting Justin Trudeau as weak and a backstabber, that the relationship, while not in open conflict, isn't really living up to potential and is frustrating people on both sides. I take that on my side. I've got my students who I'm trying to train to be future swamp rats and help run Washington, but also at the Wilson Center, I have an opportunity to work with current Congress people and others to encourage them to think bigger and more about how Canada fits in. There's a lot of potential in this relationship, but we in the United States, I think, have a lot to do to catch up to the potential of this relationship. And that's why I think Pinware has been so crucial, because you don't really think that way. You live the Canada-US relationship every day, and good ideas and common sense can bubble up through Pinware, and you're very good about trying to put those on the Washington agenda. And in that, I'm an ally. I don't put, and maybe together we can start putting a dent in things, because we're just not doing the Canadian relationship justice with the way that we've been managing it in recent years.
Well, thank you, Chris. This is really the crux of this. When you look out for the next 20 years, I mean, here is the largest trading relationship in the history of mankind, and most people don't even know about it. Or, you know, it's such an important relationship to invest in and to nurture and to have a clear vision. Where are we going? How do we occupy this economic space in North America? And where are the, you know, where are the think tanks and where are the researchers thinking about how important is this relationship going forward?
Well, I think that there are a couple of things that are at play here. One that is important is the private sector. The problem with think tanks in Washington is they're funded usually by private money and big foundations. That's kind of how they operate. And that money flows to things that are considered to be threats or opportunities from the contributors. And often that focuses on China. It focuses on the South Sudan, issues that kind of grab your attention. But I think in the triage of dealing with all of the world's problems, Canada often seems like the one you can afford to neglect. It's the good kid in class who maybe doesn't get enough of the teacher's attention because generally you figure that they'll be okay on their own. We understand the dynamic at a human level, but it's really led to a neglect of Canada that has become problematic and I think frustrating for people on both sides. Secondly, I think one of the challenges that we have is in a younger generation. And I'm going to pick a little bit on Stephen Harper. I know some Harper fans will be participating in this webinar, so I expect stern emails. Please tell me off if I'm wrong here. But I think one of the biggest strategic blunders in Canadian foreign policy in my lifetime was committed by the Harper government when it elected to defund, for a cost of slightly less than $1 million a year, Canadian studies in the United States and abroad. This was not a big budget item. Stephen Harper believed that academics were a bunch of liberal or progressive left-wingers or socialists who had nothing nice to say about his government, and so why should he be, subsidizing them? But this decision of his in 2011, which has still not been reversed despite some progress under the early part of the Trudeau government on this issue. Credit to Stéphane Dion, who as an academic and foreign minister did make this a priority, but didn't have enough time to finish it. What this has meant is that in our universities in the United States, as baby boom generation professors of Canadian studies retired, Canadian studies has disappeared from many, many campuses. And what this election meant for the United States in a sort of tectonic plate shifting way was a passing of the torch from the baby boom generation, which was the largest cohort of the US electorate, really going back to before the Reagan administration to the Nixon administration, passing that on to the millennials, who are now the largest cohort in the election. What matters increasingly is not what the baby boomers think of Canada, but what the millennials think of Canada. And for many millennials, Canada was absent from their college days. They didn't hear a lot about Canada except on South Park, and that wasn't always complimentary. And they don't hate Canada. In fact, they probably have a lot of Canadian friends or friends that they play video games with remotely that they don't even realize they're Canadian. That's the nature of their world. And I think that generation is going to inherit a Canada-US relationship that's been underperforming, but also will come at it having had the hardships this millennial generation has had of the 2007-2009 financial crisis, now of the COVID financial crisis, that set them back. And I think this is a generation that is likely to be very impatient with ideology and arguments about true socialism or true conservatism, and much more interested in practical results and common sense. That's something that's always been strong in Pinware. I think it's something that needs to be better sort of embedded in our Canada-US relationship going forward. And if I have a piece of advice for Canadians, not that you need my advice, so much good work was done in the NAFTA renegotiation, bringing data to bear, not to influence US voters, but to say, you know what, we're more important in Canada than you realize. This is how many jobs Canada creates for your constituents. This is how much money we've invested in your district. This is how much your exports earn for your community, your exports to Canada. That was powerful because it was not a partisan push. All Canadian parties participated. It wasn't just the feds, the provinces participated as well. And that Team Canada effort, with a positive message, not a transactional message. So we're important, so give us what we want on softwood lumber. But it was just, recognize that we're important and we matter to you. I think made a huge impact on today's governing generation. That needs to be sustained. But as Nadia Theodore, who was Canada's Consul General in Atlanta, points out, she had the experience of being Canada's representative in Atlanta when Breonna Taylor was killed. She said Canada for too long has relied on a sort of West Coast, East Coast, boring white guy elite to guide Canada-US relations. And there is much more going on in the US. And many Canadians don't feel they have anything to say to Black Lives Matters leaders or activists, or they don't have anything to say in some of the US debates because they're so alien. But I think actually Canada's a multicultural country with a lot to say to the things that motivate millennials. And if we can start that conversation or foster it, I think it'll make a big difference for both of our countries going forward.
That's very insightful, Chris. Certainly the Team Canada approach, coming down and expanding uh, consulates and having members of parliament visit, it was a big deal. And it does need to be continued because it's so important for Americans to realize how important Canada is to us. Our colleague, Gary Marr, who's now the chair of Canada West, has this question. If the US has been more transactional than strategic as it relates to Canada, what should Canada do, which is what we're talking about, to change this? What, if anything, is the role of subnational governments?
Oh, well, I think that it's slightly different in each country. In the U.S., the states have a considerable amount of latitude, and I think one of the challenges that we're going to face in the United States, with Washington and Congress in particular being quite gridlocked, is that a lot of the initiative will come from states. They have a lot of authority. Now, it's true on the books. The Canadian Constitution gives the provinces quite a bit of latitude in the Canadian system. In the US system, though, each jurisdiction has its own constitution or charter. The cities have charter documents, counties often have charters, and we have state constitutions. And while they can't violate the Bill of Rights, they do give differential powers to states. Those of you who remember the debate about building a new bridge between Detroit and Windsor, Michigan and Ontario, it was within the power of the state legislature to deny the governor the ability to contribute Michigan's share for building that bridge. And Michigan has a balanced budget amendment and an amendment that prohibits the raising of taxes without a vote of the people. Now, that's not all states, that's this state, and that's a challenge. We saw this in the election itself, where despite the lessons of the 2000 election with the hanging chads and the pregnant chads, we still have an election that process which is different in every one of the 50 states, because states administer elections, localities administer elections. We can't solve that problem in Washington alone. So this creates the capacity for states to be partners and to demonstrate that things work. I think coming out of a period of such rhetoric and polarization, practical results are more persuasive than clever rhetoric. And I think a lot of people are looking for progress, and where Canada and the US can show that it can work in an organization like PNWER, I think that makes a huge difference. And the Canadian provinces are really important partners. They run their healthcare systems, they run their university systems, obviously with federal money in both cases, and they're responsible for leading on infrastructure there. They often are in a position to help develop good ideas, test them out in their jurisdictions. This is something that PNWER specialized in on issues like tourism, energy, building mutually reinforcing grids. I know a lot of the attention's been on oil and gas, for example, a big issue for Alberta, and pipelines like TMX or the KXL pipeline, Enbridge Line 5, which was stopped by the governor of Michigan recently and is in suspended animation. But outside of oil and gas, we also have the challenge of hydroelectric lines. Quebec building a line across Maine that could provide hydroelectricity to Massachusetts and New York. Manitoba Hydro with the potential to provide a lot of electricity in the American Midwest. Now, why do I mention that? Hard times are important, and we are going to have some hard economic times where we just can't spend all the money we want, and we're going to have to be frugal. I think value for taxpayers, not only in terms of Buy American, but also in terms of the decisions that we make about important issues going forward, will matter. So I'll give you an example. The environmentalists in both countries have been advocating action on climate change. But when you look at things like hydroelectricity from large dams, whether it's BC Hydro or Hydro-Quebec, many environmentalists find those big dams, because of the flooding of what otherwise might be forested land, are not as desirable as, say, small hydroelectric dams. Well, that may be true, but a dam once built is zero emission and renewable and provides an alternative to coal and even gas-fired plants that will help us address climate change. So in the best of all worlds, we can be picky. I think the US has to be a little less picky. Similarly, in the Midwest, we've seen real interest in small modular nuclear because it produces less waste, because it's more efficient. And many of the nuclear power plants in the Midwest, which is a region that consumes a lot of energy but has relatively less energy resources in its own area, and is a big importer from Alberta, for example, could use small modular to address the problem of its aging out nuclear reactors. Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio all have nuclear reactors. And unlike Ontario, which has been refurbishing theirs, you have real problems in those states that haven't been able to raise the money to refurbish their reactors and still need that generating capacity. Small modular could be a step in that direction. A Biden administration that's pragmatic might say, look, best of all possible worlds, we don't use nuclear, we don't use hydro. But in the world we live in, where we have to make smart choices, those are better than coal and fossil fuels. So we're going to be more ecumenical, more inclusive of different options. I think that's what will appeal to millennials. It's not an all no holds barred response, but it's a response that really challenges us to rethink some of our assumptions about what we don't want to use. Not because our values change, but because to get what we want to get done, we have to not be so picky.
This is why I love talking to you, Chris. You can go in any direction, and you have an amazing background. This is fascinating. So along those lines, looking at our friend Solomon Wong from InterVistas asks, irrespective of political strife, the Canada-US relationship is dominated by major irritants, softwood, keystone, mad cow, whatever. Sometimes these take on a life of their own to the point of interrupting the dialogue on all other fronts. How can the de-escalation of occasional irritants be better managed under a Biden-Trudeau relationship?
That's a very good question, and Solomon's somebody who's been working in the trenches on some of these issues for a long time. So I have a lot of time for his questions, and I hope this answer will live up to his standards. I think we have an idea how we can deal with this that comes from our history. The problem of the US and Canada that we've faced over the years is that the US has a very global view and is often as involved in Southeast Asia as it is in Latin America, et cetera, whereas Canada, a bit more of a homebody, has one big neighbor, that's the US, and has really got the focus and the attention on the US that the US can't muster for Canada, despite what we were saying earlier about how important the relationship is. So the way in which we've managed this in the past was to take that presidential prime ministerial relationship and use it to agree politically on how to handle a difficult issue. And on that basis, create an agreement, sometimes an executive agreement, sometimes a treaty, and empower an institution to then carry forward that agreement. To take that abstraction down to brass tacks, the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty recognized that because we share lakes and rivers, it was important to be able to address problems, whether it was on the water flow or invasive species, which I know has been a big issue for Pinware. By creating the International Joint Commission, we created a very North American style institution. There was no delegation of sovereignty. We empowered commissioners who are politically appointed in the two countries and a staff, which is technocratic and professional, to study problems when asked by the two governments. And when they study problems, they not only talk to the scientists and look at the evidence and gather data, but they hold town hall meetings in communities around the Great Lakes or in areas affected and say, what can we learn about this? Now, they can't take initiative. They have to be asked by the two governments to address the problem and come back with some recommendations on how to act. But what that allows us to do is govern smarter with the best available evidence, but without a political fight. It's just delegated to the experts who recommend, and then the politicians kick back in, and they can say, well, maybe there's a basis for an agreement in this report. Similarly, when we created the NORAD agreement to defend North American airspace against Soviet over-the-pole bombers and later ICBMs, the decision there was that we both agreed we didn't want any of those things flying over our towns and dropping nukes on us. So we would empower the military to fly over each other's territory to protect us all. And they understood their remit, that they could challenge those planes and if necessary, shoot them down to keep us safe. And on 9/11, with all the confusion that occurred, there was a Canadian commander in the chair at NORAD, and he was able to shut down airspace without having to worry about getting George W. Bush on the phone or Jean Chrétien. It happened automatically because it was within the scope of the military's understanding of their orders, which were to protect North Americans first. That's the kind of management of issues that we tried to create with the Commission on Environmental Cooperation and Commission on Labor Cooperation that we set up as part of the NAFTA. These were Bill Clinton's side agreements. It was an area where we could do some study of joint problems, and there has been some progress made in those areas. We've now adopted in the USMCA, and I don't think there's been enough attention paid to this, a very different model, which is committees of bureaucrats who are assigned the responsibility for implementing, for example, the labor value content component of the automotive rule of origin, or address the innovation in the agricultural sector. And these committees, all of which are appointed and managed by a secretariat, are a major part of implementing the USMCA structure. That could work, but I think it's really important for those committees also to have a dialogue at the state and local level so that they're bringing input from across the country, not just input from inside the Beltway into how they're going to implement USMCA. It's a very complex agreement, and a lot hinges on the decisions they make. It's important to have those people not be anonymous and to have them be much more open to input coming from other areas. But that's how I think we need to handle it. As much as possible, let's take the politics out of the relationship. And when we have remind you, you don't need to be reminded, Matt, about the Pacific salmon dispute. When we were fighting over Pacific salmon, we ended up with the Ruckelshaus-Strangway process, where David Strangway and Bill Ruckelshaus were asked by the Clinton and Chrétien governments to, as experts, to go together and to work on the issue and to come up with some recommendations on how to handle it. And that eventually got us to a new Pacific salmon treaty. I think sometimes that's what you need. You need smart people to work on problems, and that's of course why we're doing the border task force as well, although in this case we're self-appointed. No one actually asked us to do this, we're just trying to get away with it, but there you go. Sorry, anyway, just to say, I think we have to be smart about how we manage things and not expect everything to be decided in the White House. They just don't have the bandwidth for it. But if we can create a basis for agreement and then empower officials, I think we can manage a lot of these small problems and keep them small rather than big.
Thanks so much, Chris. Do you see a new Beyond the Border action plan, or what? You know, we always have some initiative between Washington and Ottawa to manage our border, and been adrift for the last 4 years. Where would you recommend we see some progress on charting a vision for the border and for the relationship?
This is a source of great frustration for me, and I know for you as well, Matt, because we had such hopes for Beyond the Border in particular. And it wasn't the first time we tried to address Canada-US border issues. PIN was involved from the very beginning with things like the Border Vision Initiative, the Cross-Border Crime Forum. Later we had the Canada-US Partnership, which had a couple of meetings regionally to talk about how we could work together. And that was all before 9/11. Then we had the Security and Prosperity Partnership, which addressed some of those issues. We then had the Beyond the Border, which was launched in an era that became dual bilateral, with the US-Mexico dialogue separate from the US-Canadian dialogue. And one of the things I think that limited its capacity to do good was that the US creates these dialogues but doesn't create a separate budget for them. And often officials would find that you had to meet in Washington because the Canadians had money to travel, but the Americans never did. And that for a rich country to be sort of cheapskating these things is a little bit embarrassing. And I think it's something that we should first address. But looking at Beyond the Border, I actually think there is potential, maybe in something that the United States and Mexico were able to set up. There's long been a border commission to deal with the US-Mexico border because, of course, of illegal immigration and other concerns. It's a border that's always had a lot of illicit traffic from drug traffickers and human traffickers. So the two governments, while we created the Beyond the Border working group between Canada and the US and Mexico took their border commission and created a commission on 21st century border management that was looking at the application of technology to regulate and get better border control. This was something that happened under Obama and continued to get better. It was twinned with something which was a US-Mexico high-level economic dialogue, which brought CEOs and economic leaders together with political leaders to set a roadmap for border facilitation. And together, those two institutions were able to do, I think, a lot of good. In the US and Canada space, I think there would be a lot of room for a high-level economic dialogue that brought the private sector's views and the views of civil society forward on how the economy could work. Oh, I'm sorry, I apparently disappeared.
Yeah, you lost your back. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know what I did, but
it's okay.
The end result though is I think we need a more permanent solution.
So we should be back now.
I think that what we both need is a more permanent solution to the border, and these ad hoc groups that work at the margins need to be supplanted with a group that's more inclusive, like some of these other institutions. We should have a permanent border commission, not one that just worries about mowing the lawn on the borderline, but one that actually is thinking about how we can advance pilot projects, that has a budget, that has commissioners, that works with DHS, but can also push DHS, just like the Permanent Joint Board on Defense has the ability to push NORAD in different directions. You sometimes need a combination of these things, and I think we've been underinvested in a border commission. We could do a lot more with that, and I don't know if we'll get that out of the Biden administration. But I'll tell you, it's one of the interesting things that I've been hearing from the rumor mill here in the swamp. The question always comes up: who's going to be ambassador to Ottawa for Biden? And you know, there's been an interesting rumor on this, and that is that a friend of Pinwer's and a friend of yours and mine, Matt, Scotty Greenwood, might be close to the top of the list. You know, former head of the Democratic Party in the state of Georgia, which obviously very important with the runoff elections coming up, but someone who's been advising senior Democrats really for decades and has been a very strong advocate for good Canada-U.S. relations as head of the Canadian American Business Council. If she were to get the nod, I would suddenly be extremely optimistic about Canada-U.S. relations. That's not to say that I don't have my disagreements with Scotty from time to time, but she's whip smart. She knows this relationship, and she's worked on our problems in the trenches. We'd be really lucky to have probably the best informed ambassador we ever sent from the United States to Canada, who'd be ready to go on day one. So I know that's only a rumor. Here in the swamp, we sometimes purport rumors because we wish they would happen. So I admit I'm really trying to promote Scotty because it would be great news for the relationship. We'll see if she gets it.
Sending my letter in today. That sounds great.
Excellent.
What about the TPP? Any chance that the U.S. will go back into the TPP, and how does Canada play a role in that process?
So I actually am very optimistic about the TPP. It's something that was negotiated by the Obama-Biden administration, and although the members of the TPP, we would call them the TPP 11, did take some things off the table when they created the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP, the version that came to life. They did so because New Zealand, in the lead, Australia, Singapore, and Japan all hoped to be able to put those things back on the table when the Americans came back, a sort of open door for the American return. In the meantime, the CPTPP has also made progress in dialogue with Korea. South Korea was left off the TPP list because the U.S. had just done a U.S.-Korea agreement, but there have been dialogues with TPP about bringing them in. And also Colombia in South America, the only member of the Pacific Alliance that has not joined the TPP. So there's actually more to gain. At the same time, we saw just this week the Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership, the RCEP, which was originally an ASEAN initiative, come to life. Now, it's not nearly as ambitious as the TPP, but it does include China. India walked away at the end, but this is really what TPP was supposed to answer, and offer a better agreement. And to the extent that TPP brings the US in, I think it's a very competitive agreement with RCEP. Not that RCEP doesn't have advantages, it's just not as ambitious in terms of reducing barriers as TPP is. One last piece, which I think is important, and then I'll come to the Canadian piece. The negotiation of the USMCA that we talked about before was done under the 2015 Bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities and Accountability Act, which was passed to give Obama the trade promotion authority to negotiate the TPP and also a transatlantic agreement as well. That was a very restrictive grant of trade promotion authority because Congress really wanted a seat at the table. And you saw that a little bit during the USMCA negotiations because Donald Trump didn't think he could get a better agreement out of Congress. So he stuck with it. Congress has been very skeptical of trade agreements of late. He nonetheless negotiated USMCA, but not quite on time. And as that trade promotion authority was about to expire, it allowed one extension. The Trump administration asked for that extension. That extension will end in the next 6 months. So President Biden inherits trade promotion authority, but in a very short time frame. That I think makes WTO reform, which would be a big negotiation, too hard to do this quickly. He'll have to get a special grant of trade promotion authority to go further. But TPP, he can do under existing authority because the negotiation was already done. So it should be very quick. And I think that President Biden would be making a huge mistake to let those first 100 days expire. He's got to move quickly on this. Now, this is where Canada can come in. There's going to be so many expectations on Joe Biden. We already know that Biden likes Trudeau. I think as much as anything else, to the extent that Canada can say, you know, of all the things you could do, hey, make sure you join the CPTPP and let's keep some of the progressive things that Canada's added to it because those have made it better. I think putting that on Biden's agenda and offering to sort of bridge some of the dialogues, not that it will need a lot of work with the other TPP members and make sure that they're welcoming the US back and do so in an expeditious manner. I think all of those things would be things that Canada could do. And they would not only be good for the US, but they'd be good for Canada as well. As you probably know, that in our dispute settlement, we decided that we were going to have investment disputes handled under USMCA using remnant Chapter 11 for Mexico in the energy sector, but then Canada and Mexico are going to resolve them using TPP rules, and the US and Canada will go back to Canada-US Free Trade Agreement rules as well. So we've created a lot of these mismatches, and the degree to which we can bring everybody together under the same umbrella, I think will make a confusing continent a little bit easier to operate in for business.
Fantastic. Well, they didn't think we could actually do this for 90 minutes, but this has been Chris, I got so many questions. There's, you know, how do we create a health jurisdiction that deals with the border? You know, I remember Alan Burson saying when we had mad cow and, you know, disease, it took 6 years to put in place a system to search animals at the border. We can't wait 6 years for the current situation. We have research, who's really tracking the costs of COVID and the closure of the border? Where is the research community and the funding for research on this most critical relationship? Those are energy strategy needs to be continental. How will the USMCA affect a continental energy strategy? Anyway, in the last 5 minutes we have, those are some of the questions. Over to you, and then we'll work toward a conclusion. But
well, I really enjoy these things, and 90 minutes never seems like enough time to even get warmed up. But I'll say a couple of things, and these are things that are possible because the tone is so improved. First, we talked about beyond the border. We should talk a little bit about regulation. You know, unlike Europe, North America really hasn't had a single market discourse. We've talked about a free trade area. We haven't talked about creating a single market for goods and services. And I've long believed that the way that we should be addressing this is not through the Regulatory Cooperation Council, piecemeal addressing individual rules and standards. Our old friend Kelly Johnson from Campbell Soup worrying about soup can sizes and pallets, all extremely valid, but rather through what has been done interestingly, between Australia and New Zealand, who like Canada and the US share a lot of common cultural and other approaches, which is to do broad mutual recognition that our standards may differ in terms of small details, but aim at the same things, human health, etc. And so we should recognize that something that's approved for consumer use or for use in the economy or in industry by Canada is good enough for the US. Now, why do I say that? First, because doing so will create a lot more winners, because you'll be able to, in a swoop, let a lot more people participate in the relationship. Secondly, it's really important for small and medium-sized businesses. The small and medium-sized businesses have enough trouble dealing with their domestic regulators to get their products approved and make sure they've got all their licenses. If they knew that doing their homework and getting their licenses in Canada gave them access to the US and vice versa, then that they'd get more bang for the buck and their participation in North American trade would grow. That's something we really started with Canada's free trade. We kept it up with NAFTA, but small and medium-sized businesses participation in the trade relationship has been falling as post 9/11 border security and other things have kind of scared off some businesses from taking a risk. We also know that small businesses have really suffered from the COVID lockdowns. Many of them don't have the money or the depth to be able to ride these crises out, and some of them have gone out of business. So if we're trying to build back better, creating a system of mutual recognition, I think would do a lot of good. Now, that doesn't mean we accept each other's regulations wholesale. We could also create a regulatory cooperation commission that focuses on exceptions where we just don't agree on the standard to avoid a race to the bottom, which I think is very important. But that puts the mechanism on the exceptions and not the rule. We could do that to address border security concerns, health concerns, recognizing that if you've passed a COVID test in Canada, it should be good enough for the US. Second thing I would do in this area is not reinvent wheels that don't need to be reinvented. One of the big challenges of health and the border is privacy. Both countries value privacy. HIPAA in the United States for health, personal privacy, Canada with very good privacy regulation. But what about when the inspector needs to know your health status? That's a sensitive subject, but if you don't reveal it, then they can't certify that you're safe to cross the border. So how do you reconcile the two? One of the places to start, I think, is voluntarily. We have the Nexus card, we have global entry, we have systems where you could self-report in order to designate yourself as essential or at least able to cross the border. This has been, I think, one of the problems with the way that we've managed border restrictions. Essential is decided by Washington and Ottawa, and there's no way to qualify as essential just by sharing information and saying what I need to do is really important. This is not in the spirit of the US or Canada, which we've always respected private initiative and people's ability to say, just tell me how I qualify and I'll do it. Tell me if I need to wear a mask. Tell me how I can take the test. I'll do what you ask me to do, but just give me a way to be able to do what I need to do. And I think that's the spirit that we need to bring in to more of the relationship. On energy and other things, a spirit of cooperation, that we share the same goals and that working together is going to be more efficient than working against each other. And maybe a last thought on energy, because I always think about this. I think that we are poised for a real change in the weather on energy. Looking particularly at Canadian energy, there's been a lot of tension between Ontario, Quebec, and of course Alberta producing oil sands oil and also producing gas, and this has been an issue with BC as well. I think coming out of COVID, there are going to be an awful lot of countries that will be so far economically set back and so desperate to recover. They're going to put off solar, windmills, expensive solutions that they just no longer feel they can afford. Now, that's not Canada and the US, but that's going to be countries like Peru. It'll be countries like the Philippines. To the extent that Canada can conscientiously produce oil that's done in the lowest carbon way possible, and that oil can be a bridge fuel for societies as they recover to try to do the best they can. And eventually, as their growth enables them to do more, and as foreign assistance helps them do more, we help them catch up. I think Canada could be part of the solution. And if Canadians saw Canadian oil as part of a solution, not part of the problem, I think we'd get better empathy and a greater sense among Canadians that they're not at odds over climate change. They're just working together at different dimensions of it. It's a truly global problem. It requires a global solution, but most importantly, it requires that we have more mutual respect and empathy for each other. And the differential effects that some things like COVID will have on all of our citizens. And the last couple of years have shown our cleavages. Sometimes they're gaps and sometimes they're gaping wounds. But what PNWR has always done so well, and one of the reasons I always love coming back to any meeting you invite me to, Matt, is to be pragmatic, to be inclusive, and to try to find solutions that work, and not worry about the ideological stripe or whether somebody's a Republican, a Democrat, an NDP, or a conservative or a liberal or a green. And I think that is the spirit of working together that will make North America great again, if it's allowed to become the flavor of the month. Anyway, I hope so.
Well, Chris, this has been just terrific. This is the essence of a lot of recommendations and substance on where we need to go in the US-Canada relationship. And Chris, I'm deeply grateful that you were able to join us for this immersive conversation.